especially since classes haven't started yet. You know, we weren't sure whether we should do this early or not, but for those who are here, we are thrilled you are here. And you're going to have a very special experience because June Black is an amazing curator and speaker. So this is June's third year beginning at the museum, and she is now our Associate Curator of Academic Programs and the Arts of the Americas and Europe. Just everything, except for Asia. But whatever we throw at June, she does in brilliant, wonderful ways, and it's just a pleasure to work with her. And one of the great things that we've found over the past 3 years, 2 years really, with June and other of our young curators in here is that they start mining our collections. And we haven't really had enough people to do that before. But what's happened is there are a number of works and artists in our collections that we haven't shown. I mean, Dora was one of those that Danielle did the show of, you know, on view now. But John Piper's another one, and there are many others, Allmeyer earlier. So we get to explore and make discoveries and then share those with you. So I'm really thrilled that June is going to do that today. With John Piper, we're going to start here and then go upstairs. And if you don't have it, we do have our new calendar of events for the fall. So make sure you mark everything down that you want to come to and come back often, but I will turn it over to you.
Okay, well, thank you, Jill, and thank you everyone for being here. As Jill mentioned, it's been a really exciting experience to kind of look through what we have in the vaults that hasn't been on view in a long time. And John Piper was an artist with whom I was very unfamiliar before I curated this exhibition and started preparing for this talk. So I'm happy to share this with you this evening. The title for the talk is one that I have shamelessly stolen from a book by Alexandra Harris, which I would really recommend. She basically looks at writers and artists, including Virginia Woolf and John Piper and a lot of people in their circle, and looks at kind of how this generation was at a crossroads. They were at once looking back to the Romantic past and really wanting to find an art that was quintessentially British, and at once looking forward to something that was more international and much more free-thinking in an aesthetic sense. And it's an excellent book. You can find it on Amazon. I would encourage you all to read it. But I have a number of slides, so we're just going to jump right in. I want to look first at some early influences for John Piper, one of which is Joseph Maylord William Turner, who obviously looms large in the English art historical landscape. And actually, John Piper's mother used to drop him at the Tate Gallery when she was going to the Army and Navy stores to do her shopping. And this was right around the time that the Tate received as a bequest from the Turner estate a huge amount of works by Turner. So this is one, this is another, and John Piper would spend his childhood sitting in the galleries at the Tate looking at all of these beautiful watercolors and oil paintings by Turner. I can't imagine a more pleasant childhood. Another big early influence for Piper was William Blake, who's also obviously huge in English art history. And in 1918, he had the opportunity to see the entire collection of Blake's illustrations for Dante's Divine Comedy. These pieces were actually owned by a single family who put them up as a single lot with Christie's in 1918. And the Tate was not in a position to be able to purchase them at that time, but the director put together sort of a consortium of private individuals and public trusts who could come together and purchase the pieces. Excuse me. And so they were put on view together at the Tate Gallery before they were distributed to their respective buyers. And Piper got to see all of these works. He was really, really enthralled by Blake's works, and he read a lot of his writings later in life. And there was one question that really stuck with him that Blake posed in his writings, and that was, shall painting be confined to the sordid drudgery of facsimile representations of merely mortal and perishing substances? and not be, as poetry and music are, elevated to its own proper sphere of invention and visionary conception. So I think that you can really see that question at play in Piper's work. He's trying to negotiate how to deal with representation and really use it for what he wants to use it for. So he does a lot of landscapes and architectural paintings, which we'll look at, but if realism isn't working for him, he alters it. So he would often change a sunny sky to a gloomy one to portray the mood and the drama that he wanted to. So here's another of the Blake illustrations from the Divine Comedy. And another really important early influence was Diaghilev. Piper went to a lot of Ballet Russe performances in the late teens and 20s. And in 1919, he saw the London premiere of The Three-Cornered Hat, for which Picasso did all the stage sets and the costumes, and Manuel de Fayet did the score. So it was a really wonderful performance, and John Piper saw it right there in London in 1919. After it premiered in London, it was added to the Ballet Russe's list of performances that they repeated because it was so popular. So this painting is in the Rothschild collection at the Harvard Library, and you can see, in contrast to the other things he was looking at as a young man, this is really starting to give him an idea of what's going on in terms of continental, the avant-garde. So you see a much more stylized landscape than, for example, we see in Turner's work. And this is the curtain for the ballet, and I wanted to share this because you may have seen it in the news recently. It's been on view at the Four Seasons in New York since 1959, but recently the new owner has decided to remove this because he wanted to put more contemporary paintings on view. This caused a number of sort of legal battles because it's on a very brittle curtain, and so people were concerned that if they tried to move it, the pigment would just crack off of the fiber surface. So this was quite a lengthy battle, what was going to happen to the piece, but just a few weeks ago, on September 7th, I believe it was, a team of engineers and conservators came together and figured out how to move this to its new home at the New York Historical Society. So if you Google that, you can see a video on the New York Times showing the process of taking this off of the wall, which is pretty fascinating. So shortly after Piper saw this ballet, he was about at the point where he was going to be graduating from Epsom, which is a very famous boys' school in Britain. And his parents had been very supportive of his artistic inclinations when he was a young boy. But when it came time to graduate, his father was a solicitor, his older brother was a solicitor, and it was understood that John would also be a solicitor. And John sort of pleaded his case with his father, and a deal was struck wherein his father would pay for art school after he did all of the licensing necessary for him to become a solicitor. He started out on that trajectory and was sort of a Sunday painter while he was working at his father's firm. His father died actually before he was able to complete his licensure, and actually around that time he did fail his exams. So when he failed and when his father died, he didn't go back to that, even though it was stipulated in his father's will that he wouldn't receive any money as an inheritance unless he did in fact get his license. But his mother extended a little bit of goodwill to him and allowed him to go to art school. So he went first to the Richmond College. He was advised to go there to work on his life drawing skills. So after he had sort of advanced in his draftsmanship, he was admitted to the Royal College of Art. And it was there that he met his first wife, who was Eileen Holding. She was also an artist, obviously. She was very influenced by the constructivist aesthetic. And so they were two young, struggling art students, and Piper turned to writing, art and literary criticism to pay the bills. So most likely due to a not met deadline, he was asked by Leonard Woolf, who was Virginia Woolf's husband, to prepare a piece, a review of some Daumier lithographs that had been on view. And so that was published in 1929. But he was up against Roger Fry at the Nation and Athenaeum. And if you are not familiar with Roger Fry, he was the art critic in England at the time. He was also an artist in his own right. This is a very nice sort of post-impressionist Cézanne-inspired piece. But Roger Fry was actually the person who came up with the term post-impressionism, and he also came up with a very important art historical theory called formalism, which basically suggested that art must be sort of divorced from the quotidian aspects of life and be protected from these details that weren't really important, that it was really all about the art. So this is a piece called Essay in Abstract Design from 1914 or 15, but regardless of the year, this is very close to the time when Picasso did his still life with chair caning, which is generally recognized to be the first use of collage in a fine art setting. So we see Roger Fry including these bus tickets in this composition, and he's very in touch with what was going on in the European avant-garde. So all this to say, John Piper was not called back to the nation for quite a few years, but he started doing reviews with the Saturday Review, and he got to write a lot there, continuing with art and literary criticism. He wrote a review of D.H. Lawrence's book of poetry that was published posthumously. He did a review of classical recordings available on the gramophone, so he was really just doing a lot of different things. And once he was able to sort of demonstrate the breadth and depth of what he was able to contribute, the nation did in fact call him back. And so he continued to do reviews for them, and in 1933 he reviewed an exhibition of Kandinsky, abstract paintings that had been on view at the MacKinnon Gallery, and he caught the attention of someone whose attention he very much wanted to catch, and that was Ben Nicholson. Ben Nicholson was a very important and influential member of the 7 and 5 Society, which was founded in 1919 by a group of 7 painters and 5 sculptors. And in their 1920 exhibition catalog, which was the first exhibition that they had as a group, they said that there had been much too much made lately of isms and pioneering, and that they just all wanted none of that anymore. And that was really indicative of what's called the return to order after World War I. We have artists and literary individuals and thinkers that are just really sort of very distraught about what had happened in World War I and wanted creative endeavors to be sort of a calming place. So what is Ben Nicholson doing in this group? He basically hijacked it. By 1924, he was admitted into the group, and following him were Barbara Hepworth, who he later married, and Henry Moore, and a lot of other really influential modernists. And the way the group functioned was that they had a vote every year, and if you had more yays than nays, you were allowed to stay. And if you didn't, you were sort of voted off the island, so to speak. So by 1934, Ben Nicholson and Barbara Hepworth and Henry Moore and these individuals had basically voted all of the more traditional artists out of the group. So in 1933, when Ben Nicholson started noticing John Piper's reviews in the Saturday Review, he contacted him, and by the following spring, Piper was not only a member of the group, but he was the secretary and chairman of the hanging committee. So he was basically in charge of all of the exhibitions. I'll just show you this piece by Barbara Hepworth real quick. So this group was incredibly influential for Piper, and it was during his association with this group that he produced some of his most abstract pieces. This is a piece from 1933, right when he started to become familiar with this group. And these pieces, sort of at first glance, are just these color blocks, but then you see that these printed pages sort of function as cliffs along a seashore, and then he's cut out these elements of, I guess, oceanography and included them there. So even though there are abstract elements, he's still working within a representational style. But then the following year, when he is officially a member of the 7 and 5 Society, he's producing completely abstract constructions, such as this one. Here he's done a painting, but it's also incorporating wooden dowels. And then this one is very influenced by a constructivist aesthetic, which probably had a lot to do with his wife. It was actually constructed in 1934, then deconstructed and reconstructed later in 1967. It was acquired by the Tate the following year, so I think the reconstruction may have had to do with the Tate wanting to purchase it. This is another abstract composition from 1935. You can see here, this area might sort of function as a window, and this line is a horizon line, but other than that, he's moving into almost completely abstracted compositions. Which brings us to, speaking of abstract, in 1936, the first international showing of abstract art came to Oxford in the spring of that year, and it was called Abstract in Concrete. Here you can see a Calder mobile. This is obviously a Piet Mondrian piece, and then you have this work, which is by Nicholson, and this is by Barbara Hepworth. So it was sort of this fusion of really important international avant-garde artists with British artists. It traveled throughout England, so here are two more views from different venues. And Myfanwy Evans, John Piper's second wife, actually was the editor of one of the most important avant-garde periodicals in Britain, and she dedicated the 5th issue of her publication entirely to this exhibition. And just because I really adore 1930s periodicals, I wanted to share this with you. The entire serial run, which only lasted from 1935 to 37, was recently digitized by the Pompidou in Paris, and there's actually a Commons page that has started indexing periodicals from the 1930s, so if that is your fancy at all, I would encourage you to Google it. So by the late 1930s, though, we're already seeing Piper moving back towards a more representational style. Obviously, this piece is employing collage elements, which is a very modernist aesthetic, but there's a clearly delineated horizon line here, very clear cloud forms, architectural forms. There's even a doorway here and an archway here. So he's really moving back towards his original interests in art. And this was actually sort of spurred on by the war. So in 1940, he was asked by Sir Kenneth Clarke to be part of the War Artist Scheme. And one of his commissions was to paint control rooms. And his work, along with the work of other artists, were exhibited in galleries throughout England, sort of as a morale booster for people on the home front to know what was happening with the soldiers. And then around that same time, he was also asked to participate in what was originally called the Scheme for Recording the Changing Face of Britain, and was later reduced to just recording Britain. It functioned very similarly to the WPA here, but artists were given commissions and they went out to various areas in the UK and sort of did these really lovely works. They were not very much in fashion in sort of the 60s, 70s, 80s, but they're starting to be re-examined as very important productions in the 40s. So John Piper contributed extensively to this, and part of the idea was to present really idyllic views of Britain, but part of the other function of this was to actually paint pieces that had been damaged by the war. So many of Piper's pieces actually are sort of almost elegies to what had been lost in the war, and in a way had been lost to modernism as well. So this is one of his first pieces from 1941. It's of Byland Abbey, and I think sort of with the sorrowful atmospheric effect here, you can see that he's calling to mind some of these more romantic artists. This is a lovely piece by Constable that I really enjoy. He painted this while he was on his honeymoon, but you see the importance of ruins in British art production. And then this is a piece by John Sell Cotman, and Piper was very fond of Cotman. He enjoyed looking at his works at the National Gallery and at the Tate a lot, and he actually wrote about him in the Architectural Review. And he said, he saw a desiccated chapel or a decrepit brick wall toppling above long grass as a symbol full of meaning. For he saw in such things the symbolic flames of his own life, from which he hoped, with increasing despair, that a phoenix would rise. And so I think John Piper was trying to get a phoenix to rise in England too. He was really hoping that his paintings would be hopeful to people. Even though they do show the destruction of the war, they're still meant to be hopeful representations. This is one of the most famous pieces that he did for Recording Britain. The Coventry Cathedral was bombed in the fall of 1940, and John Piper actually came there. He was called by Sir Kenneth Clarke to come to Coventry the morning after the bombing, and he said to his biographer, Francis Spalding, that he felt incredibly embarrassed to be there among the ruins with his sketchbook and his camera, but he produced these really lovely paintings of the ruins. And these paintings sort of became a national symbol of Britain standing up against fascism. And we'll see that this was very important later when some of these churches were being rebuilt. But so this is his painting of Coventry. So the Queen was taken to an exhibition of Recording Britain works, and she selected John Piper to do a series of paintings of Windsor Castle. Previously, Paul Sandby, who's a very famous 18th century British artist, had done a lovely series of Windsor Castle. This is one of the quadrangle. So the Queen had something along these lines in mind, but what she got was this. And there's all sorts of really interesting notes from people employed by the royal family about what a strange man Mr. Piper was and why on earth was he making such gloomy representations of Windsor Castle. So the royal family had relocated to Windsor in the fall of 1940. It was bombed at around the same time. Buckingham Palace was bombed at around the same time that Coventry was. So the royal family relocated, which is what prompted the Queen to commission these pieces. And probably she wanted something hopeful as well that would make the situation of her forced relocation not so bad. But this is what she got. And when the king saw them, he famously remarked to Piper that it looks like he didn't have very good luck with the weather. But actually, Piper added the stormy skies. On most of the days that he was sketching, the weather was just fine. So it was just sort of something that he enjoyed doing, was making these very gloomy, very romantic renditions. So back to Coventry Cathedral. This is an archival photo from 1940 that was taken the morning after the bombing. And then this is a contemporary photo of the space. It's very celebrated among architects for what they were able to do in terms of open architecture and maintaining these ruins. So in the early 1950s, it was decided that Coventry would be rebuilt. So the ruins here are from a 14th century Gothic cathedral, and 700 architects originally submitted designs for rebuilding the cathedral. Out of that, it was sort of winnowed down to 200, and then Sir Basil Spence ended up winning the commission. And so these are some of the drawings that he submitted initially. And I want to just spend a moment looking at this right here. Graham Sutherland, who actually attended Epsom with John Piper and is a very influential 20th century British artist, ended up receiving the commission to do the tapestry. So this is what it looks like today. And these are some of the sketches that he produced during the 50s. And here are some details of the ox of St. Luke and the lion of St. Mark. And my colleague Danielle Knapp and I were commenting how closely these works resemble Morris Graves' pieces. And Morris Graves was visiting the UK around this time, so we're wondering if there might be some coincidence there. But okay, back to Piper. So this is one of Spence's views from the southeast. This is the window that Piper was commissioned to do the stained glass for. He did quite a number of stained glass commissions, but this is the one for which he is best known. Here's a better look at the window close up from the exterior and then on the inside. So John Piper worked with a glassmaker named Patrick Renshins, and there's a really, really funny documentary on Goldmark. Goldmark is a gallery in England, but they produce documentaries of the artists that they work with. And they made a really wonderful documentary wherein Patrick Renshins takes credit for almost all of Piper's stained glass designs, which is pretty amusing. I don't know how much truth there is to that, but his story is that his mother had just sent him a book on Bernini, and when he and John Piper were considering how to tackle the problem of the baptistry window at Coventry Cathedral, that they had to do what Bernini had done at the Baldachin in St. Peter's. So you can see here that there's a sunburst under the canopy of the Baldachin, and that is what Patrick Renshins said that he told John Piper to do. And so you can see that there is a sunburst in the center, and it's meant to, again, with this hopeful idea of the sun's rays, and also the Son of God as well. So I've included also this sort of faded image from the 1970s because I like that you can see all of the detail here in the glass itself. And there are all these really lovely cartoons that Piper did so that Patrick Renshins could produce the glass panels themselves. And they've been on the market recently. So Goldmark has a number of these on their website that you can look at. They're in varying hues. Patrick Renshins also said that in an attempt to sort of unify the blues and the greens that Piper did in his drawings, that he wanted to have a single glass color to mix in amongst all the colors. And so he went to a commercial glass company and got green traffic lights. They had made too many of them. And so he melted the glass down and incorporated them in all of the green hues so that there would be a unifying tone. And this is a sample that John produced at the time and gave to a friend of his. It's now in the Stained Glass Museum, but this gives you a better idea of what the windows look like up close. This is another stained glass commission that he received for the Metropolitan Cathedral of Christ the King in Liverpool. It's not a very beautiful cathedral, it's quite odd, but John Piper's portion of it is really the best area. And what's interesting about this commission is that he and Patrick Renshins had to make the stained glass load-bearing. So they used a French technique called dalle de verre, wherein basically the glass is in very, very thick slabs. So that's what they did here in the corona of the cathedral. John Piper also received a number of commissions for tapestry work. So this is a tapestry that he did for the Chichester Cathedral. And there was a very interesting person who was part of the clergy at Chichester who commissioned a lot of really wonderful contemporary artists to produce things for the cathedral in the 60s. So he commissioned John Piper to do this. Here's a cartoon for the Ox of St. Luke. You can see it's much more abstracted here, and then becomes slightly more solid, but still abstracted here in the final version. But so this clergyman also produced or commissioned a stained glass composition by Chagall, and Leonard Bernstein and Benjamin Britten actually produced musical scores that were sung at the church as well. So an interesting cathedral to be sure. So Piper also produced a number of stage sets. His wife, Mafanwy, was a librettist for Benjamin Britten. And this is a picture of this is John Piper here and his wife, Mafanwy. These are their children, and this is Benjamin Britten. So they all went to Venice to research for Death in Venice. And so John produced the backdrop for this, as well as all of the stage sets, and Mafanwy had written the libretto for this. So much later, the sketches that he had made for the stage sets were turned into screen prints, and they were produced in a portfolio. These are all at the Tate Gallery, and I really enjoy them. They're sort of gothic and charming. And I wanted to show this slide as a point of comparison. You can see from his architectural paintings that he was producing for Recording Britain that there is a suppression of detail over here with St. Mary Laporte. He sort of uses these wide swaths of color, and by the 70s, he's much more interested in architectural details and really sort of modeling these forms. So I want to talk just briefly about prints, and then we can go upstairs and look at what's actually in the gallery. This print and the one that I'm going to show just in a moment are from a series he did called Retrospective Churches, and they're lithographs. And you can see here that he's made use of the lithography method by doing sort of these scribbly lines with a lithography crayon, and down here he's got some strange markings. But you can see with these black and red and white compositions another return to sort of constructivism and the avant-garde period, even within his architectural views. And then this piece. In the late 1960s, he started using photographic materials and incorporating them into prints. And the easiest way to do that is with the screen printing process. So he started to do quite a number of series. He was sort of an avid amateur photographer, so during the whole time here he was doing a lot of photography as well that would aid him in composing his paintings. But then in the 60s he starts to incorporate the pictures into prints. And so the Ion Camera series we have on view upstairs, and the pieces that I'm going to show you now are works in the series that we don't have in our collection, so just as a point of comparison. But so basically he photographed his wife Myfanwy, and then sort of manipulated the photographs and included them in these screen prints. And you can see here in the background he's got some marbling, which he actually used to do in the bathtub of his own home. Marbling requires a lot of pigments and oils to be put into a trough of some sort, and then the paper dips into it and then you take it out. So he used to do this in his own bathtub, which I'm sure his wife loved. Here we see a very abstract sort of version of this photograph on the right. It's taken directly from these forms here. And you can see that he was working on this series throughout the 70s and 80s. And this is one that he actually produced as an 80th anniversary portfolio for the Tate in London. So those are all of the images that I have, and I thought we could just run upstairs and look at the Ion Camera series that we have, and then the travel notes as well. But does anyone have any questions for while we're down here?
I was reading about him. I might have gotten mixed up with somebody else. But, didn't he, like, early on work with a good friend of travel guides?
He did. Well, actually, that's a great question, Beverly. So when he was very little, he did travel guides when his family was vacationing. So that was what he worked on when he was younger. But then he actually worked with Betjeman, the British poet. Yes. They worked on what was called the Shell Guides for 5 decades. And actually, John Piper commented that he felt like he had lost a limb when those ceased to be published. So Betjeman wrote the text, and John Piper did the drawings for that, and they are much beloved by people in Britain. Yes, Betjeman. Okay, any other questions, or should we head upstairs?
Do you know how they came into our collection?
I do. So they were gifted by Dr. Lewis Burrows, who taught at Mount Sinai for a number of years. I actually tried to reach out to him when I was researching for this talk, and he's an emeritus professor now, so I wasn't able to get in touch with him. But he gifted them through the Ackerman Foundation, which gave works to really important modern and contemporary works to colleges and universities around the country. So that's how they came to be in our collection, and we are certainly grateful for them. Oh, did you? That's good. Any other questions? Okay, we'll head upstairs.